Hey everyone, Professor Parsons here, and today I'm going to be briefly talking about Mark Sagoff's article, Animal Liberationism and Environmentalism, Quick Marriage, Messy Divorce. And in this article, Sagoff argues that the main goals of animal liberationism are at odds with the sort of main or characteristic goals of environmentalism. So if you're an animal liberationist, you kind of can't be an environmentalist. And if your main concerns are environmental in nature, you ought not be an animal liberationist. Now, part of the reason why Sagoff thinks that there's conflict here is because of the characteristic goals. So he takes it behind both movements. So Sagoff says that the main goal of animal liberationism is to promote the welfare and independence of non human animals. And obviously, concern for non human animals can be articulated in many ways, but he mainly talks about it from sort of Peter Singer's utilitarian perspective and then Tom Reagan and others' animal rights perspective. So, just to re summarize that, I know we talked about this in class previously. If you're a utilitarian like Peter Singer, you're going to hold that receptacle view of value. So the example in class we used was the red Solo cup that's full of really expensive whiskey. To the extent you care about the whiskey inside of the cup, you're going to have some kind of concern for the cup. But independently of the whiskey inside of the cup, the cup has little to no value whatsoever. Uh, and that's how utilitarians broadly construe to understand the nature of moral status. So it is your interests and preferences that warrant moral consideration, and you, as a receptacle, warrant moral consideration simply because you possess those interests and preferences. Tom Reagan, on the other hand, denies this. Tom Reagan says no, non-human animal lives in general, matter not because certain lives possess interests and preferences. The interests and preferences matter because the lives matter. So Singer doesn't advocate anything remotely close to an animal rights perspective here. But so even though Tom Reagan and Peter Singer agree that we ought to be extending egalitarian care and consideration and concern to non-human animals, they arrive at this position for completely different reasons. Okay, now, but the other thing that Sagoff talks about, and this is where things get interesting, is that he thinks that the animal liberationist actually needs to say much more than this. He points out the fact that animal liberationists typically focus on domesticated animals. So we talk about human cruelty to animals, the fact that we use non human animals as a food source, the fact that we use non human animals for medical and scientific testing, the fact that we exploit animals for labor. We treat animals as if they just exist to satisfy our interests and our preferences. We keep animals in captivity for entertainment, for education. We keep animals as pets. And this is a really sort of human centered or anthropocentric way of looking at animals. And certainly it is true. Sagoff thinks that almost everybody agrees that cruelty to animals is wrong. Almost everybody agrees we should not be cruel to animals. But Sagoff thinks it's interesting that animal liberationists claim that they are here to promote the welfare and independence of animals, and yet they only focus on domesticated animals. So, if animal welfare is really the main concern here, Sagoff argues that we should not only be focusing our attention on how human interventions in nature cause non human animals to suffer, but we should also focus on animal suffering in general. So it's not enough to focus on how human activities and human industry and human agriculture harms non-human animals. If our main concern is with animal welfare, we ought to recognize the fact that wild animals suffer quite a bit, and they don't suffer necessarily because of our activities, our industry and our agriculture and things like that. They suffer at the hands of other non-human animals. So there's a lot of suffering in the wild, and if suffering is intrinsically bad, if pain is intrinsically bad, then Sagoff thinks that animal liberationists, to the extent that they are, at least as far as they say, primarily concerned with the welfare of non human animals in general, ought to have more concern for the suffering of animals in the wild, but instead they tend to focus all of their attention on domesticated animals. So it certainly is true, once again, that the way we domesticate animals for our purposes is cruel and largely anthropocentric. So a more biocentric or even sentiocentric perspective would be helpful here, but Sagoff thinks that it needs to extend further than that if you're an animal liberationist. So he's going to say animal liberationism cannot only be committed um, to promoting the welfare of domesticated animals, we also need to focus our attention on animals in the wild. Now, he thinks, on the other hand, the main goal or the characteristic goals of environmentalism is not primarily with promoting the welfare of non human animals, either domesticated animals or animals in the wild. For Sagoff, it seems that the main goals of environmentalism are with the promotion and preservation of things like biological diversity and ecological integrity. So environmentalists aren't necessarily concerned with the welfare of non-human animals primarily. They're concerned with the welfare of entire biotic communities, natural habitats, ecosystems, not only animal life, but also plant life, natural resources like water and land and things like this. So to the extent, and he points out the fact that Peter Singer um, uses environmentalism in scare quotes in talking about individuals that put um, land and water resources and plant life above the interests of non-human animals. He uses environmentalism in scare quotes, and Mark Sagoff says, "I don't understand why Peter Singer is using scare quotes here as if this is not real environmentalism. This has always been environmentalism. Environmentalists have always been more concerned with things other than merely the welfare of non human animals or promoting animal rights or something like that. He says environmentalists have always been concerned with land, have always been concerned with plant life and promoting biodiversity and ecological integrity. Environmentalism does not serve the purposes of promoting animal welfare. Animal welfare certainly is a part, it's a component of environmentalism, but it does not capture everything about environmentalism. Now, and it's for that reason, if Mark Sagoff is right about this, that even though animal welfare may be a component of environmentalism, it's not the whole picture of environmentalism. It means that an environmentalist can support certain kinds of programs that an animal liberationist, in all due honesty, may not actually be able to get behind or may not be able to promote. So here are some examples. First of all, it seems that the environmentalists, to the extent that they are concerned with biodiversity, has more ground to give special consideration to endangered species than an animal liberationist might. At least an animal liberationist who is a egalitarian about non-human animal lives. An animal liberationist who thinks that all non-human animal lives are morally equal. So, for example, if we're in a position where we are forced to kill an animal to eat it, um, we have the choice between killing 10 chickens and killing one black rhino. Now, if all animal lives are equal, kind of we'll think like a utilitarian here on utilitarian grounds. If all animal lives are equal, if the life of one chicken is morally equivalent to the life of one black rhino, then it seems we should eat the black rhino. We should kill the black rhino and eat it. Why? Because we're measuring 10 lives against one. However, if you allow yourself to take into consideration the fact that the black rhino, unlike the chickens, is a member of a particularly vulnerable non-human animal population, since it is endangered, then you might go, well, yeah, I know 10 lives might be greater than one. However, if I'm concerned with promoting biodiversity, if biodiversity in nature is an intrinsic good, a world that's more biologically diverse, naturally speaking, is going to be a better world than a world that has less biodiversity. It seems that we can give the black rhino special consideration due to the fact that it is a member of a particularly vulnerable natural population. Furthermore, the environmentalist can support hunting for population control. When non human animal populations expand beyond their capacity, that's bad for the entire population. It leads to disease and starvation and things like that. And a really good way of culling natural populations is through controlled hunting programs. Another way of controlling non-human animal populations is with reintroducing apex predators into a habitat or an ecosystem. So there are wolves in Yellowstone again, because the moose and caribou populations were kind of exploding beyond their capacity. And when there were no wolves in Yellowstone, bears were the apex predators, and yeah, they're kind of slow. They're not the best hunters. They're more scavengers.